You don't know about it. Well, you should. In 1949, it was basically the last attempt of the left, I'd say the communist left, and around them, which had been so important during the 1930s. In fact, the American history was basically shaped in a great measure by communists. It's interesting, people don't know it. But they were the main force in building up the CIO and an industrial union movement. And they were strong. And then there was a break during the war when no action because of supporting the war and the Soviets and the war in general. And then 45, they tried to come back to the 30s. And they had this huge strike movement in 45, 46. And that scared them on top so much that they had a counterattack, and they did everything to break the left, this old left. And the main effort to save it was in 48 with the Third Party, with Henry Wallace, where they tried to establish a party separate from the Democrats and Republicans and put it on the map. They didn't have a chance to win, but they thought with maybe 6-7 million, it would be on the map for the future. And Henry Wallace had been vice president under Roosevelt for 4 years. He was a very popular figure, a very interesting figure, and he was the candidate for president.
In May 1942, Wallace had given the acclaimed Common Man speech.
Some have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering, the century which will come out of this war, can be and must be the century of the common man. There must be neither military nor economic imperialism. The march of freedom of the past 150 years has been a great revolution of the people. There were the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, the Russian Revolution. Each spoke for the common man. Some went to excess, but people groped their way to the light.
He called for a worldwide people's revolution and an end to colonialism. His speech was received coldly across the Atlantic.
And we knocked ourselves out. I was a student and killed ourselves first getting the name on the ballot in 50 states. In 48 then, but we did it in 45. We didn't get 3 last ones, but yeah, 45 we did. I helped collect signatures in North Carolina and mostly Massachusetts, where I was. But that was a terrible failure. He got in the end only something over 1 million votes. It was a catastrophe. They tried once again in 52, but it was dead, really. In 49, a year later, was the last attempt to buck the reactionaries. And they planned a concert, or is this of interest?
Oh, this is.
In 49, they planned a concert with Paul Robeson. You know who that was? Do you?
Not very well, no.
Oh, well, that's also, if you're studying American history, you should know. That's the last 2 books there are about him. Paul Robeson was perhaps the most famous cultural figure in the whole world. He was a black singer, actor, and political activist. He was basically a singer and actor. He was in the 20s. He got some important roles in plays by the very important dramatist Eugene O'Neill, and started singing. At first, mostly black spirituals, Negro spirituals, but things got. It was difficult in the States for a black guy then. In concert tours, they wouldn't get hotel rooms, for example, and so he moved to Britain, and became extremely popular and well known all over Britain.
9 years later, in May 1949, By arrangement with the Scottish area of the National Union of Mine Workers, Paul Robeson gave a special concert for miners in the Usher Hall, Edinburgh. All the Scottish coalfields organized parties to the capital that evening, by rail and by road. They arrived in their hundreds. That evening, the miners came to see Robeson. But the same afternoon, Paul Robeson had been to the miners. And before he went away, of course, they asked him to sing.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joel, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. In Salt Lake City, Joe, says I, am standing by my bed. They framed you on a murder charge, says Joe, but I ain't dead. Says Joe, but I ain't dead. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they can never kill went on to organize, went on to organize. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. I never died, says
And not only Britain, but he traveled to all over Europe, including Berlin, Paris, Prague, and singing. In Britain, he also acted. He did Othello, and he acted in the left-wing theater there. And then he did films, including one extremely popular, successful film, which, however, soured him because it was about Africa, and it was basically pro-colonial. He thought it would show African culture, and they had lots of dancing and so forth, but it turned out it was basically a hurrah, the British, and he, I think he went along at first, but when he went into the theater at the premiere, he got so angry he walked out. He had, however, in getting actors for it, they needed extras. He was in touch with many of the African exiles in London at the time. You know, Africa, there were no free countries in Africa except Ethiopia and Liberia. And some of them became top leaders in that country through this connection. And he was known to nobility, to the royalty, to the top levels. And then he got in touch, however, with the unemployed movement and the miners, especially in Wales and Scotland, but especially Wales.
Wales, they had a real big miners' movement.
They had a strong left-wing movement.
They still do to a smaller extent.
Well, in those days it was ruled, they ruled it, yes. And he got in touch with them and became a leftist. And then when the Spanish Civil War came, he visited there, just for a week's visit, but he sang in Madrid very close to the front with his wife who was there. And this was very important also for him as a sharp anti-fascist position. But also, after this film in London, or in England, he did lots of films, but one that's especially famous, he did one which was progressive with the Welsh miners. That did not become famous. It's politically his best film, but it was never in the theaters. But it's a great film. But because of it, you know who Eisenstein was? No. And I had this whole generation gap, which you've been deprived of, basically. You've been deprived of history. Eisenstein was the greatest Soviet film director and basically the world best. And he made a very famous film called Potemkin about a revolt of sailors against the Tsar still.
Oh, yes, we watched that for film history class.
You know that. That was Eisenstein. Eisenstein had a very interesting history. Evidently, towards the end, his relations with Stalin were not quite so good. He did a film about Mexico, therefore, which was not finished for various reasons. But he got interested in Robeson, and he invited Robeson to Moscow. They hoped to do a film about Haiti, the revolution in Haiti, with Robeson in a main role. Well, one of the main roles of the revolution, I don't know, it was a very dramatic story, but that didn't work out. However, Robeson became very close with the Soviets and visited then, traveled around a bit. He wasn't there too much, but he made several visits. He said, it's the first place I've been in where I consider myself a regular human being, treated as a human being. After 1945, he stuck to this view, and it was no longer popular. And he kept to it, and he was under more and more pressure. And in 49, especially in 49, because he came to Europe, he took part in a peace congress in Paris, where he's alleged to have said, and probably did say, black Americans would not engage in a fight for these Jim Crow racists against the Soviets. And this was, of course, picked up by the press. And then he also visited the Soviet Union. There was a Pushkin anniversary. Pushkin was a great Russian dramatist, the greatest writer, and was 1/4 African. Yeah, his grandfather was African. And but that was generally known. And they had I think, 150th birthday or death day or something. He attended that. But when he came back to the States, they hit him hard because of that statement. They built it up. And because he was just his visit to the Soviet Union in 1949 was already taboo. And they did everything to crush him. In late 49, in September, the left, led by the party, had a concert in Peekskill, which is about 100 miles north of New York, I think. An open-air concert with him to help the Civil Rights Congress, which was a left-wing protectorate, like the Civil Rights Union. It was a left wing to defense thing, but it was a left wing thing. It was before it started. What happened was that the people in Peekskill, the suburban, ex-suburban New York, a little further out, they had an anti-Robeson gathering, basically fascist Ku Klux Klanners. And they broke up this concert before it started with a real attack. They destroyed the chairs, the concert things, and in the end, the men had to form arms to defend the women and children who were there.
"900 police, the largest concentration ever to guard the area around Peekskill, New York, converged to prevent a battle between war veterans and followers of Paul Robeson. The Negro baritone draws plenty of enthusiasts from the communistic faith. But on the other side are many more who believe in free democracy, and they spare no pains to show their disapproval of the red element. Cheers and catcalls greet the incoming commie contingent. Robeson, who has professed his love of communism, was stopped from staging a concert a short time before by the same sort of anti-red rally. Only the influence of the troopers who collect commie cudgels, assisted by sworn deputies, prevent the field of battle from becoming a shambles. Over 3,000 commie sympathizers form a skirmish line.
And the police were along, but didn't come till it was already too late. Nobody was damaged severely, but it was a terrible thing. The concert didn't take place. They decided to repeat it a week later, but this time defending it. So that 1 week later, nearby, also in Peekskill, they had this big valley or basin, and in the middle was a group of trees, and in their whole circumference, they had left-wing trade unionists from New York, mostly with baseball bats, sitting there just because the crowd was trying to raid it, the fascist bunch. And this was a defensive line all around it. They were a little bit off but you could see them. And I went there, and I was one of the, I don't know how many buses, lots and lots and lots and lots of buses, lots of cars and lots of buses. My bus, they let us through with no problems. The entrance to this big basin was patrolled by cops who let us in and held back a mob on both sides, shouting all kinds of nigger, communist, Jew, kike, against Jews, niggers, black, everything. And there's a famous picture showing them like this. But they let us in. They kept them from doing anything. And so we had this really wonderful concert with Paul and with Pete Seeger. Do you know who that was?
Oh, I love Pete Seeger.
Well, Pete Seeger sang that too.
While Robeson sings, all is comparatively peaceful. But after the concert, things get a little hectic. Cars filled with the singer's admirers pull away from the concert ground. And it takes the combined efforts of all law enforcement officers to quell the uprising. "48 were rather seriously injured during the clashes, and 100 more suffered minor wounds. Governor Dewey sent a special request to Westchester County officials to prevent disorder. An unhappy performance that has only added grist to the mill of communist propaganda.
At least one other singer, a black singer, woman, Hope Foy. In any case, the concert went very well until the end. It seems that all those buses, I don't know, 100 buses or how many there were, the drivers, they were private. They rented. They had taken off during the concert.
Jeez.
And they didn't come back, so that there were no drivers. And not only that, but the men who had been on the defense, they gathered together and the police started beating them. And I got into my bus. We knew which bus. We had no driver. Who can drive a bus? In each bus they asked. And somebody in our bus could drive, and we chose one person as the leader of the bus, a black guy, and we saw them beating one black guy on the cops over the head. Turned out they didn't hit so many, but they hit him, and he was an honored veteran of the war.
I believe I know who you're talking about. He was with the Lafayette Escadrille, Foreign Legion.
I'm not sure, but that's possible. He was. And our black leader wanted to get out and help, and everybody said, "No, it's not going to. You can't help him. Stay with us." When we left the exit, there was an exit to this. The cops wouldn't let us go the way we'd come to the main road. They They pointed down a road, and basically unpaved, or a poorly paved road through the woods. And there, every 50, 100 yards, was a bunch of men and boys with piles of stones. And they pelted every car and every bus that came through. In our bus, we quickly organized. The men would sit on the outside windows with a jacket so that it would hold against. The women sit on the inside, the children in the middle. Almost every pane was broken, including the windshield. And every bus, and a lot of the cars. Some people injured badly. Nobody with us was. But when we got out of the woods, the cops stopped all the cars, and they checked the licenses. A lot of these guys, they didn't have a bus driver's license, you know? So we had to get out, and we had to walk to the nearest train stop through town with dirty looks all the way, but just dirty looks. After that, Paul Robeson, so in the newspapers, they blamed it, the big riots, etc. They blamed it on Robeson, although it had been the police. And after that, Robeson was absolutely tabooed every place. He couldn't take, it was no theater, no film, no concert appearance, nothing. He was completely barred. Not only that, but they took away his passport. So he couldn't even go to England or to Europe. And he couldn't even go to Canada, although you don't need a passport for Canada. So for 9 years, he was not only locked up in the U.S., but he was barred. Even little black congregations with a church, they'd ask him, because black people loved him. But they go to the church and say, you have to pay your we can make it tough for you. The FBI went to them. Some spited it, but basically he was barred until a movement developed, especially in England because he was so popular there, to get his passport back. And finally they had a telephone concert. That was new then, to have a connection, you know. They had a big hall in London, and he spoke and sang on the telephone to the whole. And then the Welsh did it too. They had a second one. And this made them look so silly in Washington. And the pressures. It was, by the way, it wasn't only on him, but he was the most famous one who lost his passport. They finally let him out, 58. He went to London. He played Othello for the third time. He played Othello in New York, the most popular Shakespeare play that had ever been shown on Broadway. I was there too. And he performed in London. He played in this Othello. By the way, he was pretty old now, but he did that. He traveled around. He came here, did concerts here in 60, and then he became very, very ill. His son believes that he was poisoned by the CIA, but you can't prove it. And he was completely out of. They couldn't cure him in Moscow or in London. He came here, and he was fixed up enough so that he was back more or less on his feet. Went to the States and had another breakdown. That was the end. But he was really known in the whole world. In India, Nehru was the president of India. Everybody knew. All over Africa, they named kids Paul and Paula.
Wow.
He was the most famous sculptor in the world, did a nude statue of him. He was just known to everybody, and yet they completely barred his name. By the way, he was extremely famous. He was very handsome too, very proud of his black roots. His father had been a slave.
And we've got Paul Robeson by Martin Duberman.
By the way, he's now returning. There was a stamp showing him. And he studied at Rutgers in New Jersey. Now they have a Robeson building and a street in New Brunswick named after him. So that gradually he's becoming, that's one of his roles.
Wow. It's a shame he never was actually in that movie about Haiti.
That what?
It's a shame he was never actually in that movie about Haiti.
It is a shame. Eisenstein detailed his thoughts about it with some scenes, sketches of how it might. Here's I don't know if you should take this exactly, his nude statue, but
Wow.
by the way, I should add that every place he went, women swarmed because he was big and handsome. Do it.
Several in a row. Scott Hugh, Clifford Murphy, James.
What was the first one?
Scott Hugh, but it's marked as perhaps Charles Scott.
We had a Scott. We had one Scott, Scotty.
Well, it says that he's the notes next to his name. Notably anti-communist, he fights and drinks a lot.
And what's the end? Anti-communist and?
He fights and drinks a lot.
I knew him.
Do you know what happened with him?
Probably went back some sooner or later. Took off.
And you said that underground network, which was bringing people back with taxis, the U.S. was interested in it, so presumably we didn't know who they were.
I don't know if they didn't need to know. But one of them was a funny case. I'd have to think a little to remember his name if I can. He deserted with his wife or his girlfriend, I don't know, German, and was here and was a weird character because he was obviously lying. He told all kinds of stories about his past, and every time he told it, it was different. So we all joked about how his... And then suddenly, he disappeared again, or the both of them. In other words, they went back. And the fellows heard about that on AFN, that he returned. Armed Forces. Mm-hmm. They said another guy came back. And then after a while, he's back again. And with a story that his wife had secreted a file into a cake that gave him. We figure it's one of his big lies. But I think it may be true. In any case, he showed up again. They were wacky. She too was wacky. We used to hear stories that she'd she'd get room service and naked, which in those days was not. Although we didn't hear that she was making out with anybody else, but he was. I remember he came to this English fellow who I worked with. They were all asking for money all the time. All asking the German authorities for more money, and begging for more money with all kinds of excuses. That's why I had trouble, because I had to translate all that bullshit that they were telling. He said, what'll I do now? I swallowed my gold tooth. And he wanted money. The Germans, they didn't want to offend anybody. They were so nice, they were over nice, because they didn't want to have anybody leave. It would look bad for them with the Soviets, as long as the Soviets were here. If people took off, that looked bad for the GDR people. So they wanted to keep people. And the Americans and the others, they used that to blackmail them. I need 200, 300. Otherwise, I may not be here so long. And they'd succumb. But this was the Englishman. He didn't fall. He said, I can only advise you one thing: buy yourself a sieve, for your gold tooth.
Who was this? What was his name?
Sharp. What's his first name? He was a communist from England, and he also worked in the clubhouse, and he stayed in the clubhouse, which I didn't, as I left them. He stayed and worked in the clubhouse, sort of. And there's a whole staff at the clubhouse, and we were both part of it. And for example, he ran the canteen, because when we were there, nobody was living there. Later, they put people up there. We were given, first we were put up in a hotel until they could find a room for us. For me.
It's very odd. It just seems like It seems like such a weird journey to just be cycling from hotels to a clubhouse to...
Oh, yeah, it's a small town. It's easy to walk. With me, it was funny. I came with 3 Welshmen. They were in this house in Potsdam where I was kept for 2 months, you know. We were locked up there, incommunicado, very comfortably, but locked up. And I couldn't figure out, I had found there were others there. I couldn't figure out who the hell could be in my situation. It's such an unusual situation, you know, having deserted because I was a leftist, for God's sakes. There'd be nobody else in that position in the whole world. But here there were other people there, including one I noticed when I went to the bathroom. In the sink, there was a hair, obviously for an African or African-American. What the hell, who could it be? In any case, when I was finally freed after 2 months and taken to Bautzen, driven to Bautzen, with me were 3 Welshmen. They had been soldiers who came across. They had been in trouble because they'd been in AWOL too often and drinking. And they were a happy-go-lucky bunch who, when they got here, immediately started to get into trouble. The very first night, we were brought here, and it was pretty late, so we were put up in a sort of like a hostel at the station, and given 20 euros for expenses for getting. And then, of course, all they wanted was beer because they didn't get beer in Potsdam, so they wanted beer. So we went to we found some dive, and went in there, and there's one young woman there. Then in uniform, they had this FDJ guy, and she wasn't very good looking, but I was interested in talking to a young East German. But one of the 3 of us, the one who drank the most, he got friendly with her and went home with her. We were told to stay in the hostel, not to leave until the next morning someone would pick us up. We shouldn't leave the hospital, our hostel. Well, we all went to the bar, but then we went back to the hostel, not him. He went to her place and didn't show up. In the morning, he still wasn't there. Well, finally, the cops brought him in. He had obviously made out with her and didn't find his way back and was probably drunk. And right in trouble from the start. I thought, my God.
You don't have Ubers back then.
What kind of where have I landed? But and the four of us were put up in this hotel, 2 to a room, and I was luckily not with this the drunken. He was the happiest, but the biggest drinker. This other one was also a drinker, but he was an intense little guy, a miner, Welsh miner, but a soldier. A Welsh miner, and not leftist, but Welsh miners, you know. And the third one was a smart guy. He was the cleverest. In any case, I was already working in this factory. I come home to this hotel room, go to bed, and just when I'm just about not quite going to sleep, the 3 of them come back from their drinking tour, and the clump. I think it was a lump or clump. He was the most drunk. He came into my room. The others went to their room. He came to my room, although he wasn't my partner, but he came in. Oh, hello, he says, did you have a hard day at work? He said, sort of kidding me about it, you know, because they weren't working. And then he took a pillow and he threw it at the chandelier, the glass chandelier. 3 parts, 1 part came down on the bed. Oh, God. And then he walked over to the wash basin with a mirror, and there was a glass cigarette ashtray, one of these heavy glass. He takes that and he looks at the mirror and he's just about to throw it, and the smart one just walked in, luckily, and he saw that. He says, "Hey, what was that? Trump. I think he said, "Hey, don't you know breaking a mirror, that's 7 years bad luck?" He said, "Oh, yeah, that's right." This was my initiation
Lots of smart people. Well, one of the men who was in that clubhouse with you, this was a very interesting inclusion in the document. Richard Kaufman, the document said...
Yes, he was killed. Oh, he died.
Yes. Well, the document says he loved the Russians and would write songs and poems about them, but was killed by 3 Germans who hated him.
I don't know where they get all this information. I knew Kaufman. I can't believe that he wrote any poems. He was Jewish, which would tend to make one think he would have been somewhat more educated. Not necessarily, but more likely. But he never learned any German, as I recall. I think he wasn't. I don't think he was very intelligent enough to write poems. But maybe he did. I never heard of it. In any case, he went to this dive, this bar, which was about the worst one in Bautzen. There were several like this that were low-down dives. He went there, and evidently he got into a fight there. And he got hit on the head or somehow, or banged his, or got something, and went outside. I think he collapsed. But his girlfriend took him to her home, but evidently didn't take him to a doctor, or wasn't able to, or didn't dare to for some reason, or whatever. In any case, he died. There was a rumor, no, not a rumor, but there was another one of the defectors, the only one from Ireland, who claims that he was in the IRA, although who knows. The people claimed anything, because there was a rule among the Bautzen people, the defectors, at least, maybe it wasn't among the others, but it seemed to be an etiquette. You don't ask people why they're there. No questions, you know. But this Irish guy was a peculiar guy, and he disappeared right after Kaufman's death. And therefore, we surmised that he may have put the Germans up, gotten them fighting, or somehow joined in. And therefore, he took off immediately. He disappeared. Went back to Ireland or wherever he went back. In any case, he left. You know, in the early GDR years, up until 1953, when the Soviets were still in control, and the judges were new and very dedicated anti-fascists, there were some nasty sentences for people also for anti. There were, it was mostly against Nazis, but also including social democrats who opposed the party, and they were locked up. But first of all, I never heard of such long sentences, and second of all, after the new course, which began in June 1953, so far as I know, almost all of these cases of people being locked up for telling jokes or stuff were all freed. This is a new course. So this, just for telling, for speaking, unless you went around holding
a sign,
or you know, giving rallies against them, which I can't believe. It sounds rather funny to me.
It comes from a CIA agent.
Yeah, who knows what they knew. But that's interesting.
Well, I mean...
Does that imply that some CIA agent was reporting there?
Yes, that's what it seems to be. Because
it does seem that way.
The document says from our agents, basically, or from a defector or someone on the ground.
Well, that's what I think it is. It could be somebody who was there as for the CIA, but I kind of doubt. I think what it is when they crossed back, they were grilled. That's when they were grilled about me, they because of my name change. You know, they showed them a picture of me. Is that him? Yeah, that's him. It's not Victor Grossman. That could be. And what these guys said when they got back was not always exactly the truth.
Yeah, you've kind of established
they would have made GDR sound worse.
Well, and also they were, a lot of them, drunks and liked to fight.
But in any case, to get better sentences, they would try and stress we were really against them all the time. against those commies. They would be saying, naturally, we made a mistake, we made a blunder in going there, we didn't know what we were getting into.
And
once we found out how terrible they are, then we left. They wanted to get easier sentences. I heard that Art Shearer, I did read, I got from the Stars and Stripes, recorded their return. And I think it recorded his return too. I think he got 10 years.
Jeez.
But let me tell you this. There's a guy, either a professor or at least a teacher in New Jersey who did all the research on all of these guys and sent me loads of material on each one, their background and what happened to them. Well, what happened, I went in my sophomore year, I went to the Bronx High School of Science. And the Bronx High School of Science was visited by smart kids from all over New York. And that was in 1941, I guess, 40. In any case, mostly leftist. But we had hot discussions, club discussions, debates between the different left-wing groups. And the cleverest and the best was the CP group. And one of the fellows there, who was the best speaker, a very interesting guy whom I got to know better, he was the master of that. And one day he asked me, would you consider joining the Young Communist League? So I did. I said yes. Till then, there was a youth, the Youth Congress, I forget the exact name. It was one of these, what they call United Front organizations. There was a United Student, it was a students, that's right. There were all kinds of organizations, the unions, but also nationality groups like the Polish group and so forth, left wing. And one of them was the student group. And it was mostly college students, but they had extra for high schools. And so I was in that just at the time of Pearl Harbor. And I joined that. And as part of that, this guy said, do you want to join the Young Communist League? Which I did. I must have been 13 or 14. And this was interesting because this was at a time when the Communist Party had dissolved itself. You know that, do you?
I wasn't. I thought that it was still around.
In 43.
Oh, for the war.
Yeah, well, Stalin dissolved this Communist International. Basically, because they were fighting with the Americans and British together, and so as not to antagonize them with world revolution. And for whatever other reasons, Stalin not alone, but basically Stalin, dissolved the Communist International and urged, evidently, communist parties around the world to break up as parties, so as to get into this united front against fascism. And this is what happened. Not all of them did it, but especially in Latin America and Canada and the USA, it dissolved. Some people didn't want that, but some did. And it dissolved. There was a big fight, actually. They did, so that for the 44, 45, there was no party. It was a communist association, or something. No, it had another name, but a communist. But it wasn't a party. And it lost a lot of its support, especially among blacks and in the factories, where it gave up its factory groups, and also among blacks, because they wanted to keep fighting against Jim Crow, and the communists said everything to win the war. So there were problems. In 45 came a letter, a famous letter, in a French communist magazine by a French communist leader, but many people think it was Stalin in back of it, which basically said it was a mistake to dissolve the communist parties. We should refound them. And so in the USA, they threw out the leader who had broken up the party, Earl Browder, and reinstalled the older leadership by Foster, and set the party going again. And this is, shortly after that, I think months only after that is when I landed at Harvard, and another fellow there recruited me into the CP. So I should add, in the youth movement, the Young Communist League had also been dissolved, and decided no longer to be communist, to be leftist generally, and called itself American Youth for Democracy. And I didn't like the change. I didn't like it, so I didn't go. But after some months, I found that it was the same group. The same leader, this woman, Nina. She was again the president of the club. And I think they even used the same name, International Friendship or some whatever, the name of the club. So I went, and I fell for Nina. And Nina and her girlfriend, Eloise, they both attracted me greatly. And I kept going, and I stayed in the AYD. And at Harvard, I joined this other fellow to try and form an AYD group at Harvard, which we did. But while doing that, he also recruited me to join the party. But this is the very complicated story. The Communist Party in the 20s was very sectarian. Then in the mid-30s, there was a big change in the whole world, communist movement. United Front and People's Front joined everybody who was against the fascists, even bourgeois, even social democrats. Even if they're against the Nazis and the fascists, we join in a front. And what this meant was that in the United States, they formed all these organizations, like the United Student Council or whatever. But also, it meant a revival of interest in American culture. And this is what got people like Pete Seeger. They came into this movement. He was a communist. And joined Woody Guthrie, who was his teacher and mentor, who also became a communist, so sort of a wandering communist. And they formed the Almanac Chorus, which was made of communists or pro-communists. And they made all these songs, protest songs, and anti-war songs, and union songs. And they built us up as the Almanac Singers until 1939. 1939 came the Stalin-Hitler Pact. And the communist movement split, like now, very similarly. Some saying, we break with the Soviets completely, they're working with the Nazis. The others said, there's a reason for it. We stay pro-Soviet. And this split was never healed, really. You had the people who were anti-Stalin became the liberals and moved up, and also later became the worst reactionaries in the war, in the Vietnam War. Whereas the others stayed communists, and they were the ones I told you before who tried to revive the movement after 1945 with Robeson, etc. And but the communist movement never completely revived after this 1939-1941 break, which also hit other countries, but it hit the U.S. worst.
Could I ask you, in the very early history of CPUSA, so before you joined, in 1928, they directed their chapters to support black sovereignty because of a Soviet agreement that the black Americans were an oppressed race. And so Jim Allen, who I really love as an author, Jim Allen, he did the Scottsboro Boys case.
Yeah.
And Vice President candidate James Ford both called for a Soviet Negro Republic in Alabama. That is unheard of history where I'm from in the Deep South. Are you familiar with this?
Well, not exactly like that, but very familiar with the question. First of all, it wasn't the Soviets who said that. It was the Communist International, which of course was dominated by the Soviet Union, but it wasn't only. They had big debates about the question of U.S. blacks, with black American communists taking part. So that it was not a dictate it was partly a response. In the United States, you had black leaders, left-wing leaders, who said the black belt in the U.S., which was, you know where that's the black belt?
Oh yeah, I live in it.
Huh?
I live in it.
Right. But it's not exactly state conform. It cuts across the South. I think part of Georgia, a lot of Georgia, and a good deal of Alabama, Mississippi, into Louisiana, Arkansas, and just a bit into Texas, was majority black. And there were leaders, I think Haywood was one of them, who said, we must set up, not a Soviet, but I don't think that slogan was ever, I never heard that slogan before. The slogan was a national state of our own. And they used the definition of a state, which was official among communists, a contiguous territory with the same language and the same culture, and more or less, I think, the same geography. And on the basis of this, you had books written, I think I have one or two, who said that this should be independent. At least we should raise the call for an independent black state. This was then dropped in the 30s.
Well, I take the term Soviet because it strikes me as somewhat similar to the Bavarian Soviet or the Irish Soviet or the kind of a movement of left-wing.
But they didn't, well, of course of all, they didn't use the word Soviet. In Bavaria, it was Räte, they used the German word. I don't even think they said workers. I'm not sure. There was a revolution in Germany, not only in Bavaria, which was supposed to be socialist, you know. I've just been doing research on that. In fact, one of my most recent bulletins is about that, or at least touches on that. Because in November 1918, the revolt of the sailors and the workers and the soldiers in Kiel and North, they got rid of the Kaiser and they got rid of the whole Kaiserreich, and they forced the armistice. And their call was a socialist republic, and their leader, Karl Liebknecht, he announced the socialist republic from the balcony of the city of the palace, which has been rebuilt, sadly enough. He announced the German Socialist Republic, but at the same time, in fact, a couple of hours earlier, the Social Democrats in the Reichstag building had announced the Democratic Republic. So, and that's when they fought, you know, they fought bloodily for the next few weeks and a couple of months. And of course, you know who won. So that that was a call for a socialist republic. I don't think they spoke of the Soviets, but I don't think they used the Russian word, which is important too. Well, what they hoped for, I wrote an introduction to a book about this, which was published in the States recently in English. One of the leaders, an interesting guy called Radek, he was Polish, but Jewish Polish, and raised with German language in the family, as many were, upper class, spoke German. He left Poland. He argued with Luxembourg. So he left the party there, went to Germany, became active in the Social Democratic Party before the war, and when that supported the war, the Social Democrats, the First World War, he went to Switzerland, and he joined Lenin and took that famous train trip, you know, the SEAL train. You know what?
I think I know who you're talking about, but I haven't heard the train trip.
Oh, very famous. What happened is that Lenin was in Switzerland in exile, and a whole bunch. And they came the March Revolution in Russia with Kerensky. And he wanted to get to Russia. He wanted to change that into a socialist revolution. But he was in Switzerland, and the war was on. How do you get from Switzerland to Russia, which was a pro-French British, through Germany, which was anti? Germany offered a SEAL train for Lenin and his whole tribe to go through Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, to Russia. The conditions were nobody leaves the train, no communication, locked up in the train, but go right straight through. And of course, in the West, a lot of people said, "What? He's treacherous. He's helping the Kaiser," you know. But he wanted to get to, and he did. He got to Leningrad, or then it was St. Petersburg, in April, and started organizing the Socialist Revolution. And so, yeah, I don't know how he got there, but yeah. So this guy I'm talking about, Radek, this Polish guy, he was in that train, but he stopped off in Sweden to organize money for the revolution. He went to Germany right after the war to help organize a socialist revolution here, because they still hoped, especially Lenin, they hoped that the Soviet Union, that Russia would just be the starting point. And the most important country then, after that, was Germany. They hoped for a socialist revolution. And it almost looked like one in November 18.
Oh, it got close.
It came close. And in Bavaria, in Munich also.
In Bremen. And
also in Saxony-Thüringen. The communist socialists, social democrats had a joint coalition. And this guy Radek, who was Polish, German, and Russian connection, he came to Germany especially, but he got arrested. He was in jail for a year. But it didn't work out. They tried again in 1923 to make it a socialist revolution in Germany, but it was broken. It didn't work out. So that Germany, Russia was all alone.
Well, on the topic of splits within CPUSA, there's two interesting figures. Robert Shelton Hart, who I believe was the bodyguard for Trotsky, and he died mysteriously several months before Trotsky was killed. There's still debate on how he died. And Juliet Stewart Points, a co-founder of the CPUSA, she vanished.
What's her name?
Juliet Stewart Points.
I don't know the name. I'm interested.
She disappeared, and Carlos Tresca, the trade unionist, was speaking out saying that she had been killed. Carlo Tresca, I believe.
Tresca, yeah.
Tresca. Some people say he was killed by the mob. Some people say Stalin did it. Some people say... Basically, you have those three people dying. You know, Hart was the bodyguard, and he was supposed to, apparently, according to the Russians, let in the assassins. But he died, somehow.
Where?
In Mexico City, for Trotsky. So I guess I'm wondering, because especially Robert Shelton Hart, he was apparently from New York. It might have been a fake name, but this is his photo.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
It's been a long time.
I don't remember him.
But I'm wondering, because I mean, within the CPUSA, you have Hart and you have Juliet Points, who is a co-founder of the CPUSA.
They were not known. Who was known was Cannon. Who wasn't his name Cannon? I think. Who broke from the party and went to the Trotsky side, and he broke. But that was also in the 20s. He was the famous one. He was a leader in the CP, broke away, and became a leading Trotskyist. And the other, I thought you would name, the most famous, was Lovestone. You know Lovestone? Lovestone was not only a leader, I think for a short time he was the leader of the CP. J. Lovestone. He came from the needle trades in New York, you know, the very socialist left-wing sewing trades.
Mm-hmm.
And he took the wrong side in the Soviet Union. He went over to this Bukharin bunch, who then became the anti-Stalin bunch, and pro-Stalin, pro-Trotsky. But I don't think he became a Trotsky. What he did become was a virulent anti-communist, in fact, the leader, because he joined with this needle trade union, which had been left, was taken over by right-wing Social Democrats. His name was David Dubinsky, the head of it, which became absolutely virulently anti-communist. And from there, he became active in the auto workers, which was the main union in the CIO in the 30s. And he was thrown out there, and he became basically, he moved over then to the AFL, which was the right wing, stayed on with the AFL and then later AFL-CIO, and became their anti-communist expert for all the world. He was the connection with the CIA. He was the one who, he didn't like to leave New York. He almost never traveled, but he had an agent called Irving and Brown. And Irving Brown, after 45, went all around the world, but especially in Western Europe, trying to split the support for the communists, which was very strong because of the Red Army defeating Nazis. So that the Communist Party, especially in France, in Italy, where they led the resistance, in France too, in fact, all of Western Europe, it was the communists who were most active in fighting the Nazis. And they had terrific prestige in France and Italy especially. His job was to break that up, which he did, with money from the AFL-CIO and from the CIA. He bought out leaders of the union movement in France and to split the union there, which they did, and therefore split a strike. And after splitting the union there, it meant that the common cause between the communists and the socialists, which had been during the war, was broken apart. Then he went to Italy and did the same thing. Broke a strike with mafia thugs were hired as strikebreakers, as scabs in Marseille, so that they broke the Italian unity. They did the same in Netherlands and all around the world. In Latin America, Irving Brown was the man, but Lodestone was in back of it all with the CIA. It was an extremely lively group. They were very brilliant people. Among them, I think 7 or 8 became top leading professors in their fields in various universities. Really very. And this meant that the level of our discussions in the party group, which we kept secret, because we were afraid. We were very active, but not as party. We were active as American Youth for Democracy, or then we had a John Reed Club named after this John Reed, or we had other activities, but not as communists, but we were the communists. And our groups, we got to the size of over 30 people at one point. We couldn't meet together because that would be too conspicuous. We broke up into 3 small groups. We could meet in Boston. We'd have to go to Boston to have everybody together. But it was a brilliant group, and they were full of jokes and irony. We didn't take ourselves too seriously. We argued a lot about this fellow Mike Gold, whom I mentioned before, was a great influence on me, because he wrote the cultural column in the Daily Worker, and he was more for proletarianized culture, working class. These guys were all from intellectual backgrounds, almost all of them, so that they were, for them, he was not perhaps intellectual enough, but I learned more from them than from college, from lectures or anything. I learned a great deal from them. They were brilliant guys. At least 2 or 3 of them came from this so-called coup in New York, the co-op, which is a housing development started by the left, which was a very left tradition in the Bronx. And they grew up there, and everything was left there, so that they really had that tradition, which I didn't quite have. I didn't have the intellectual tradition. I had just... But then I went to Buffalo, and I was in the working class party, which was, by 1950, 49, 50, was falling apart. And I was there practically in its death throes. Well, the club I was in was all black people who had joined during or right after the war because the Communist Party was the leading party fighting against racism. I don't know if you know that, but it was the only party with the Scottsboro case.
At the very beginning, yeah.
Yes, and you know Gene Herndon?
No.
From Georgia, from Atlanta. No?
I think James Allen might have mentioned him a little bit.
Oh, he should have.
But he changed his politics a little bit. He became more of a populist.
I don't know if he did, but when I know that he was arrested for, he was a leader of the communists.
Yes,
he was arrested and imprisoned, and I think he was sentenced to either, maybe not life, but a long sentence term. There was a big fight to save him. And the lawyer who came down was Benjamin Davis from New York, a black lawyer, who helped save him, get him free, and who became a leading communist then. And in fact, he became a city councilor in New York City of the Communist Party, Benjamin Davis. But that was his start. That's when he joined the party in supporting Herndon. That was in about 32, when the party was really becoming a leading force in the whole United States. That's why I read a review in the New York Times about a book written by somebody who tells about his communist parents and upbringing. Well, he was no longer, but he was defending his father more or less. But the reviewer said he just can't. The reviewer said he couldn't understand. He himself, the reviewer, couldn't understand how the father could be such a dreary, dull organization with nothing but jargon and boring phrases from Russia or from Marx. He didn't realize, and I wrote it in a letter, which of course was not published. The Communist Party was not only leading in the union movement and in anti-racism, but in the cultural field. Not all, but a very high percentage of the best writers, authors, filmmakers, dramatists, artists, composers, they were all either communists or very close to it. All, from almost you go down the list. And this meant that there was an extremely live cultural. They tried to say it was all just pro-Stalin. Stalin didn't mean that much. We were fighting against Jim Crow, or against for the unions. We supported Stalin too, and we thought he was the greatest. We didn't know much about what was some of the things that were happening there, or we didn't want to believe it. And we supported the Soviet policy, but it wasn't just hurrah Stalin. That's not where we joined the left. We joined it to fight racism, and to fight for strong unions, and to fight against unemployment, etc., etc.
Well, a couple more questions. Alfred Corella, I'm wondering if you ever met him, and how the National Committee for a Free Germany kind of was incorporated into East Germany after the war.
Alfred Corella, I never met him, but I've heard him speak. I was at a meeting where he spoke, which was painful because he had a very, very serious, he couldn't, he'd break, he couldn't say a word, What do you call it? Not stuttering, but it's like stuttering. It was pretty tough to listen to him, but he evidently managed to get to the Soviet Union right at the beginning, and even to meet Lenin. And I guess he was there during the whole exile period. And when he came here, he was a leading light in the cultural field. I think he was considered generally by intellectuals as being part of the hard rock 150%ers. I think he was considered that, because the intellectuals were very split up in the GDR years. Just as to the left is today, you had some who were 150% the line. You had some who were really very anti-GDR but couldn't say it, or didn't say it until they left. And you had a lot of people who were very critical but basically pro-GDR. And so, and who was how much for what? It varied, That's why people read books so much here. It was the readingest country in the world. people read books and books and books and books and books. They were extremely cheap. And you read them to see what the author, new books by GDR authors, and then later Russians too, and Eastern European. Is this guy critical because he's against the whole idea, against the whole system, and he's pro-Western in other words? Or is he basically pro, but critical, but can't be too critical because that wouldn't get through? So that it was a strange, you never knew it. You debated, is this book more so or more so, and what is he trying to say? Which made it very interesting literature. But this is also hit in the magazines. And Carella was in the Academy of Arts, which is where I work with this archive, this Robeson archive. That's how I heard him at meeting. I think only one, though, where he spoke. And I don't remember what he said. But I think he was considered one of those who was less for opening up, was more for closing down. In other words, there was a tendency to keep trying opening up the connections with left-wing literature people or artists and so forth in West Germany. Some who wanted to keep those lines open, and some who said, whenever you meet up with them, they're out to break us. And there was some truth to that too, but it varied. It varied over the years. In the early years, there was an attempt by the Minister of Culture, who had been in exile, a poet, Johannes R. Becker. He wanted to have the GDR preserve the traditions of German literature, Goethe, Schiller, etc., and also not to make a break with the literature people in the West. This tradition was carried on by others, by Stefan Hermine and others. Others said, we have to build up our own socialist German literature, not so much, including some like Brecht, who said, not so interested in the old, not that he rejected it, but we have to look for the revolutionary traditions in German history and make new ones. And so that you had various tendencies which changed with the political development in the world. When Khrushchev came, things eased up. When Khrushchev was thrown out, tightened up, for example. And so when it eased up after 53, after this uprising, eased up, people got out of prison, like I said. People could write more freely, could write more openly, could write more critically. And then came 56 in Hungary, when they, the whole revolt. That's when they tightened the screws. They got frightened at the top. They got frightened it'll happen here too. They tightened the screws. That happened again with Prague. When they tightened the screws, they got frightened it's going to happen here too. Then eased up again. Honecker, when he took over from Ulbricht, people expected he was much tighter. No, he eased things under the influence of Konrad Wolf, the head of the academy, and the brother of Misha Wolf, the spy chief. But then came this Biermann business, this poet who was kept out of the GDR, and that split the intellectuals. It was like this. But I don't think I knew any Russian. You didn't meet many Russians here. They kept to themselves. 2 Russian families here in this building. They were both connected with trade. They were part of some trade organization. There are lots of trade organizations.
But not like KGB or any kind of intelligence.
No, yeah, I'm sure they reported on things like every person in a foreign country, every American involved in some major enterprise in the Soviet Union or here reported to the CIA before and afterwards, and vice versa.
So you're talking about Vincent Muller.
Yeah, Vincent Muller was one of the 9, I think it was, generals, or top generals, who, during the war in the Soviet Union, switched sides and broke with Hitler and helped form one of the two organizations in the Soviet Union during the war. One was for soldiers or officers, and one was for top officers, only officers, anti-Hitler. And this, the one with the top officers, mostly they had been the ones who had been captured at Stalingrad. And they were so angry that Hitler betrayed them at Stalingrad that they switched sides. But others, for various reasons, they turned against Hitler. And the ones in the other organization, the broader organization, this included exiled German communists.
Oh, many of them are buried over near Rosa Luxemburg.
Many. Yes, many are there. Well, except that there may be some of them in a military cemetery someplace. I'm not sure how many are buried there. But they were considered traitors by most of the German officers, of course, for helping the Soviets. But a group of them, 9 leading generals, and I don't know how many others of the lesser officers and soldiers. Some of them just because they lived in East Germany and they wanted to go home to East Germany, not to West Germany. But in any case, when the GDR got going, they worked for they helped build the German army, the East German army. Now, first they helped before the German army, before the East German army, the Volksarmee. They were needed to help build the police, the transport police, which was separate, for trains and so forth, state, and also Stasi. And the GDR didn't have military people, except those who fought in Spain. Well, that was just a few hundred, and most of them had just fought on the lines, with a rifle or a machine gun. They weren't organizers. They weren't officers, except at the lowest level. They had almost no trained officers to build an army with. They used those officers who had switched sides and who stayed switched after the war, because some of them, as soon as the war was over, they went back to the West and tried to sneak back into not to be ostracized. Most of them were ostracized. But some of them stayed here and helped build the East and West German armies were started in 1955. But before them, they had predecessors. They called them the barracked Volkspolice here. They Kasernierte Volks. They had something over there too. They helped build it up until the GDR felt it had its own enough to do without them. And by the way, the top people were always anti-fascist resistance, not these guys. What happened was that in East Germany, before the GDR was formed, at first 3 parties were permitted. The communists as not fascist. The Communist Party, Social Democratic, and the Liberal Democratic Party. And I think the CDU, the Christian Democrats. They were permitted. When the GDR was formed, they were allowed. And 2 new parties were formed. One, well, first of all, the Communists and the Social Democrats merged to form the Socialist Unity Party. So the Social Democrats were out. They were part of the SED. But you still have the SED, that's Social Democrats and Communists. You have the Liberal Democrats, you have the Christian Democrats. Then they formed a Farmers' Party, and they formed an NDPD. And what that meant was that you had 4 parties in the National Front. The SED, that's the ruling Communist, Social Democratic Party, but basically Communist Party. The Christian Democrats, and so the NDPD, the Liberals, and the Christians. That's 6, I think. How many is that? And they were part of the National Front, which means that, first of all, they were all represented in the Volkskammer, the Congress. They were represented at every level of government. They all agreed that the leading party was the working class party. That's the SED. So that they were all, you can't say subservient, but they all looked at them as its leader. And this meant that in the People's Chamber and at all levels, they were all represented, but they all voted unitedly, with one exception. They all voted according to the SED, but they all maintained a certain individuality, which supported the GDR officially. However, it was also a place where people who were not so pro sneaked in to get a job, that they wanted to be in some kind of administrative job. They said, we're for the GDR and for the SED, but they stayed in like the Christian Democrats and the Liberal Democrats and the Farmer Party.
And the NDPD would have...
And the NDPD was formed especially for people who had been Nazis or under officers, but who had no crimes, who had just gone along. In other words, who fellow travelers with the Nazis. That was a local, awful, millions of people joined the Nazi Party, just either to get a job or to get a promotion, just like later with the SED and today with parties too. But they had never done anything nasty. And this party was done to enlist them and involve them in government too, so that they were represented right up to the top. And that means all these parties had certain ministries. I forget which one. The NDPD had one or two ministries each, but the key industries were the SED.